Mabhur Ahmed is founder and director of Restless Beings, a UK-based human rights group, and he's on Zoom to reflect on the worsening situation in Myanmar. He's in London. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Welcome to the program. It's sad to see this loss of life, but it does seem that the military is having to step up its actions to try and stop this resistance.
Yeah, I mean, that's one narrative of one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that there is 53 million people in Myanmar who are legitimately calling for a transformation from this military dictatorship into a democracy. And what we're seeing now is that military dictatorship is clinging on with all its power and might. And enacting brutality on civilian populations, albeit, in the face of arson attacks. But regardless of that, it is a civilian population, and it is the military who are, in effect, firing upon unarmed protesters and arbitrarily arresting many dozens.
Do you think that the Myanmar military is living in the past and that they misread the current state of the country after Aung San Suu Kyi won so resoundingly at the polls? That really should have been an indicator for them of what the feeling is on the ground.
Yeah, I think there is some degree of misreading, but also at the same time, there's a lot of following previous precedent from the textbooks of Burmese military dictatorship. This is not the first time, of course, that the people of Myanmar have stood up in the face of the junta. And it's not the first time that the military dictatorship has used brutal force against its own people as well. I think, given current status of the world, in essence, with social media and the connectivity of people, I think this is where the misreading comes into play. Whereas in previous iterations of this, the military has been far more organized with its the power and might that it has, and simply the numbers that it has and the artillery it has. This time round, in 2021, with the use of social media, we're seeing very targeted, very organized protesters organizing themselves in such a way that the military actually cannot cope on all the different frontiers. I mean, this is not just these protests are not just centered in Yangon or in Mandalay. It's all over the country, and the military at the end of the day has limited numbers, and because it's trying to see away, if you like, the many cities that are protesting at the same time, simultaneously and vociferously. This is the reason why brutal force is being used. I think the other thing is that the Burmese military have always used force against their own people, and their own people have always eventually backed down. We're coming up to nearly 6 weeks of protests since the coup started on the 1st of February, and there seems to be unabated kind of interest and desire for the protesters to continue until and unless they actually see the ushering in of a new democratic process in Myanmar.
What do you think is different this time around? Because you have said that, this isn't the first time that the Burmese have resisted the authorities, but there seems to be an almost it's now or never kind of feeling at the moment.
I think the first thing is the people of Myanmar have actually united to some degree in this very current round of protests. What I mean by that is the ethnic groups have come together, many different civil society groups have come together. And although there is some degree of confusion over, the united call, their unity is not in question. So there are some amongst the protesters who are obviously protesting for the release of Suu Kyi and for the NLD party to kind of take its place at the helm of democracy, as the elections in 2020 have shown. But also at the same time, there are many ethnic groups who now have found an agency through these protests to actually put their points together and try to bring a union of ethnic groups around the country. So I think that's one major thing. The second major thing I've already mentioned is social media. And then thirdly, I think there's been quite a lot of interest internationally. The international community more or less seems to be united in their disdain towards the Burmese military, the Myanmar military. However, that translation to action is really what's missing here. The international community has voiced many words of condemnation and support for the protesters, but it hasn't actually resulted in any policy or dramatic policy shift, which is probably what's required in order for that eventual regime change. And one of the big reasons, and of course, the brutality of Sunday was, in protection of Chinese interests, and it's the Chinese veto within the United Nations Security Council alongside that of Russia, which is really, if you like, holding up the international diplomacy front to kind of oversee that regime change.
I was just about to get into China because it's almost as if the Myanmar military, as long as they have the backing of China and Russia, they feel emboldened to carry on doing what they're doing.
Well, absolutely. I mean, and I think South Africa is a very brilliant example of what happens when there are certain parts of the international community that still lend support to a movement or to a governance structure which is brutal towards its own people. And only unless and until there is unity in the international community, and that's what's lacking, with China and with Russia. Until there's international unity within condemnation and diplomatic circles, then really, they will feel emboldened. And at the moment, with Sunday's brutality, like I said, it was all in protection of Chinese-owned business and property. And, that really is indicative of the kind of policing system that we have in this kind of capitalist world that we find ourselves in now as well, with the protection of property and business seemingly ahead of civilian populations. And that's what we saw. We saw property being defended by the security forces and the people who were attacking those property, civilians, being brutally shot down. And, I think you mentioned 140 or so. I mean, that number has risen to over 180 now. And day by day, it's not like a single day has gone by where there's not been murder and death. These numbers are creeping up slowly. And I think, this is all very reminiscent. The tactics that are being used, arson and mass shooting and mass arrest, is all very similar to what we saw with the Rohingya genocide in 2017 and the repression that the military showed towards the Rohingya people, again, people of Myanmar. And we're seeing the same thing against, more mainstream populations within Myanmar now as well.
Is the country functioning in the meantime? Is the civil service going to work? What is the state of play?
Well, I think that's one of the brilliant aspects of this protest movement, is that they've actually organized to such a point where the country is basically on a meltdown. It cannot function in the way that a state needs to function, and that is probably the most effective way to oust the military junta from its power. Because without a functioning civil service, really, what does the junta control? I mean, it has control of a lot of the railways and roadways and the banking system at the moment, but much of civilians' life is really shut down with these protests. And what we've seen has been huge numbers, and we're not talking in the thousands or in the tens of thousands. We're talking about in the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions, who have protested across the last 6 weeks, and that's really brought the country down to its knees. And like I said, that's probably the most effective way to oust the military junta from its kind of despotic rule for the last 60 years.
With the mounting death toll, it will become increasingly difficult for Russia and China, I'm guessing, to continue to support the military in terms of how they're dealing with the uprising. Or will they just turn a blind eye irregardless?
I mean, it should do, right? I mean, we're all part of the human race, and it should do. The international community and China and Russia particularly should find it more and more difficult to defend the position of Myanmar. But of course, when we're talking about the kind of the economic and the geopolitical situation hand in hand, and the systemic kind of problems within the United Nations Security Council, so long as any country, for that matter, holds a veto over a Security Council and it's not based on consensus, then you're going to continually see this type of thing. I mean, we see the same thing happening in Israel with the US veto continually backing repression against the Palestinian people. And in the same way, China and Russia are simply using what's rightfully theirs, I guess, the veto, to support their own interests. But, you know, like I said, it begs a question about the system within which we operate internationally. You know, is this Security Council, is the United Nations now really in need of absolute overhaul? Because as we've seen time and time again, you know, when there is atrocities and destruction occurring against civilians and populations across many parts of the world, it seems to be that whichever Security Council member has an interest in that country, they will back them to the back teeth and essentially, you know, block any kind of actual action taking place to be able to resolve the situation. So, you know, I think China and Russia will continue to wield and use their veto, and in effect, they will turn a blind eye because it protects their interests, China specifically.
One gets a sense that as a resolution is found eventually, that a massive reset button will probably have been pressed this time around. Let's speculate a little bit about what the future might look like. I mean, the military certainly won't enjoy the same kind of power that's enjoyed for decades now, or is that a little bit naive of me?
No, I don't think it's naive. I think, you know, if the protests are successful, that, you know, one of the key questions that really needs to be asked internally and externally is what are the state of play for human rights within Burma, within Myanmar? Because for the last 60 years, whether that's ethnic groups or whether it's civilian population at large, repression and kind of the denigration of human rights has been the order of play. And once, you know, we're talking about 2 generations worth of human rights abuses. Once that's happened for such a long period of time, unfortunately, it becomes systemic, it becomes deep-rooted. So even if the military were to now take a step back and were to have their power reduced significantly, you know, there will still obviously be remnants of the human rights abuse even within civilian society, and there'll be elements of xenophobia and elements of all types of isms within society that have been established by the military. So that's going to take a long time to overcome and to overhaul. But I think, you know, there has to be some hope that, you know, any country in the world, look, the job of any military is to protect a country, not to rule a country. And I think that's really where, you know, in line with democratic reforms across the world, you know, military leadership, dictatorship really is, you know, very unusual, and it makes people feel claustrophobic in their rights, and rightfully so. And I think that whole situation will need to be addressed further down the line. I think what is absolutely of essential importance right now is that the military are removed from governance. And that's the first step. What happens thereafter will take many years probably of reconciliation.
Do you have any idea how deep in the military this fiefdom exists? Because we often find that the foot soldiers follow orders but are perhaps not genuinely behind their military leaders, and so that if you take away the military leadership, then actually things could change significantly.
I mean, I refer back to my last answer. You know, when we're talking about 60 years, we're talking about 2 generations of military leadership. Many of those who are in the military and who are in that top brass and even lower down the chain would have been so for the last 2 generations. I mean, most of the times in these types of situations, we see there's almost a military class, you know, families who are born into military and who continue the legacy of military. So I think they'll, you know, even though that there are some defections frictions among some of the foot soldiers, as you said. It runs deep. It runs really, really deep. I mean, even the fact that this coup really came upon as a shock really shows how tightly knit the circle of the military is, that there wasn't any kind of leaks to the media. There wasn't kind of, huge calls from months before that this might happen. We all knew that this was possible, that the military were capable of doing this, but it didn't actually seem like this was transpiring into a coup. So the fact that it was also tight-lipped and has been so well coordinated and sustained suggests that there is, within military ranks, that the top brass, the generals, the secretary and the chief commander-in-chief really do have that popular support of the military people. And generally the Burmese public, the Myanmar public, have been supportive of the military to some degree or the other in the past as well. I think what's really quite clear now, and it's a binary, is that there is the military and then there's civilian society. And civilian society has, vociferously, unanimously said that no more for this Burmese military, for this junta, and that they can't really continue. They don't have any more legitimacy left. The only legitimacy that they have is through their weaponry, and they will continue to exercise that until, I guess, they can't anymore. And whether that's really from international community, diplomatic relations, etc., or whether that's through, kind of the protesters taking a more violent nature in their approach, remains to be seen.
Mabhur Ahmed, we're going to have to leave it there. Your insights on the situation in Myanmar, greatly appreciated. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good evening.